In the year 2048, people are raving about a fighting race called the Immortal Grand Prix, or IGPX. In the IGPX, 2 teams of 3 IG machines, which are high-tech humanoid mechs driven by humans, race to compete in the Immortal Grand Prix to win the championship. Takashi leads Team Satomi, which is made up of a group of young amateur pilots who must make the most of their limited funds as they try to compete in the IGPX to hopefully one day become champions. Starting with the positives, the concept of mechas that are racing is really unique in my opinion, and it's definitely fresh from the usual politics, war, Gundam shows that at least I've seen. And while I do enjoy those shows, it's definitely awesome to see something different. At the start, I wasn't a fan of our main characters, but as time went on, they started to grow on me, and I ended up liking them towards the end. Amy, Liz, and Takashi, I felt all had good chemistry together when they were racing, and outside of the racing, I felt they were fun characters to look at. Takashi, though, he is a little bit bland at the start, but as I said, as the story progresses and as the story keeps going, I actually started to root for him and definitely started to like him a bit more. The anime was done by Studio B Train, and while it's not the greatest looking show in the entire world, some of the characters are very generic, the animation itself isn't bad. And while the CGI racing and all the mechs isn't the best thing ever, it still isn't the worst either. It's definitely better than something like Handshakers, which I guess would be pretty easy to be better than Handshakers, but for a show that came out in 2005, it wasn't bad. One of the biggest positives I have for this show is the music. The soundtrack was really good. The opening is a bit cheesy, but I still enjoyed it. And the ED is a pretty good song too, but the background music was so good. And it fit every single scene. When the show is trying to be sad, it plays this really nice song. When it's trying to be action-packed, it really does get you pumped up. And as I said, the opening is very cheesy, but the song is so good. And man, I'm so happy that they kept it throughout these 2 cores and they didn't change it, because nothing could have topped that great OP. My final positive for IGPX is that the second half of the show was my favorite part. Personally, the races just felt more interesting. There was a lot more at stake. Characters were doubting themselves, and there was some really good development in that second part. And not to say that season 1 was bad, and I'll talk about season 1 a bit more in my negatives, but in my opinion, the show really kicked itself in the ass and just became way better in the second half than in the first. Like, the villains were more interesting, the final race was really good, and I thought this show had a really good ending. Moving on to something I thought was just okay was the dub. While the dub wasn't downright terrible, you do get some pretty famous actors like Haley Joel Osment and Michelle Rodriguez, respectively. The rest of the cast was pretty good. You do get some notable names, but I felt it wasn't their best performances. They definitely could have done better, but still nowhere near a bad dub. It was just okay. And moving over to my negatives is that the show isn't paced very well, at least in the beginning. It's a bit slow to get through, and if someone told me, they dropped it just because it was boring, I could completely understand why, because the characters really aren't that interesting. The people that they're racing in season 1, again, aren't that interesting. Though, if you do stick through this, the show does get better, but by that time it may be a little bit too late for some people. And my final negative for the show is that the mech designs themselves aren't really that great. There are some cool looking robots, but a majority of them were kind of basic and kind of lame. I'm not a fan of how bulky some of them can be, and overall I just wasn't a fan of the mech designs, so I'll probably not be getting any toys of them anytime soon. Overall, I did enjoy IGPX. Yeah, there are some pacing issues in season 1, and a lot of the characters really aren't that interesting, but as the show went on, it did get better, and my overall recommendation is just to stream it. I don't think it's worthy enough to be on your shelf, especially because the DVDs are out of print, but I do think it's worthy enough to at least stream. And if you do drop it towards season 1, I completely understand, but if you stick along with it, I think you might enjoy it. Big thanks to Miasma Senpai, Warpbait, and my newest patron, Ash the Man. Thank you so much for supporting me on Patreon. You guys rock.